Maakuworri Island by U.C. Hafso. It was December 18, 1973, and we had arrived at the northern end of Maakuworri Island in Tussle Bay, having journeyed over 1,500 kilometres through the temperamental Southern Ocean. At a latitude 54 degrees 37 and longitude 158 degrees 54, appeared dense and unconscious mist clinging tightly to formidable sea cliffs, as if afraid of the great nothingness that surrounded this remote landmass. Distant and eager echoes of humanity greeted us from the isthmus on the island's northern end, as the ocean pushed 12-foot swells against the sharp rocks. We were forced to anchor some 800 metres offshore with albatross, giant petrels, and raucous gulls above the ship's stern. Further down the coast, huge communities of emperor penguins populated the beach at Half Moon Bay, like the most detailed of Impressionists' work. Rolling in the waves, we awaited in a now or never tension. OIC Dr. Landy appeared, cutting bravely through the surf in the DUKW amphibious vehicle, collecting our crew of 10, safely returning us to the shore, then taxiing back for supplies, equipment, our 5 canine compatriots, and the all-important crates of 1080, norbermide, and newly developed eradication compounds. Our mission was to exterminate the European rabbit population of over 100,000 and remove the impacts of this invasive species, which had long been causing immense havoc to the soil, bird-nesting burrows, and native vegetation of this fragile island. We had been tasked with this mission through the generous and singular assistance of the Frahil Foundation. The expectation was planned and overseen via distance by Professor M.D. Leary and the privately funded intervention committee made up of scientists, businessmen, and public faces, including Test cricketer Merv Boone. On shore, we were greeted with the most startling of images. A naked man, bearded and with dry hair to the shoulders, standing hauntingly in a robust bird cage. PhD student Anna Navalny froze, fell to her side and fractured her wrist. Alas, the prank was cut short. Long-term residents Hemsworth, the biologist, in the cage, and Mulder, the tradesman, lost their smiles and came to the immediate aid of Navalny. It was not the last practical joke on Maakuworri, but from that point the importance of our work and the professional dedication to it embedded an unquestionably serious tone on the social fabric of our new community, one that would lead us through the 2-month stay and some of us to a dreadful secrecy that has of yet remained uncovered. Feeling as if we had ventured to the ends of the earth, I spent some insular moments soaking it all in. In this most remote place, where humans had long since made their mark, I was made aware of my aloofness, considering the isolation of that moment. Like any other, that moment in time, that present, was an island unto itself, amidst not just the vastness of life on earth, but the amazing scale and reach of human expedition. My own memories trickled in the shallows compared to the old adventurous spirits of hundreds of years earlier, which had beaten against the coasts of time, eroding this very island of the present in which I breathed, howling in the wind in which I stood, and shaping the future to come. As I gazed upon the rusted death of a boiler and digester, still standing despite 100 years of the earth's nastiest weather, I thought of the hundreds of thousands of elephant seals and penguins processed for their oil in this beaker of most predictable experiments. I thought of the whales and the fur seals that had been slaughtered with enterprising spirit by need and greed, and there I was enlightened with an ecocentric urge. There I waited, gazing upon the rabbit-ruined hillsides of the North Head, promising myself to dive into our work with a diligence in service to science, beyond any utilitarian or humanitarian heroism, one in harmony with the non-human wants and needs of this most unique and startling island. This energy proved to be both admirable and antagonistic to some, who had figures to find, people to appease, trouble to be quashed, and secrets to hide. That evening, the community, having swelled from 3 to 13, enjoyed feasting on new provisions and a convivial atmosphere of camaraderie and anticipation. The diversity of our party was evident in profession and in point of view, as conversation passed from dinner to the island and to deeper existentialisms. "Simple, isn't it?" said Dr. Landy, OIC, at the end of the long table. "Every rabbit we eat is a run on the board for the native species." "No more rabbit for you, or have you become so hardy down here that you can handle a bit of 1080, Doctor?" replied Stevens, the toxicology expert. "The native species?" inquired Navalny. "What sort of collateral do you expect?" "There'll be collateral. We can't say how many, but there'll be losses of native species, particularly birds," said Landy. April O'Neill scribbled shorthand notes. She was a well-dressed and delicate woman, out of place, appearing to need physical comfort more than facts. Landy ran through the historical context of our expedition, revealing to O'Neill that over the centuries humans had brought to the island donkeys, pigs, goats, fowl, and cows that were brought here by half-wits. What was the Christopher Flanagan quote?" said Stevens. "Nothing could warrant any civilised creature living on such a spot as this." "So the sealers were uncivilised. What about us?" asked O'Neill. "Well, April, you have been here 3 hours. We've been here 19 months. I've been here on and off for 7 years. What do you think of us, uncivilised?" He held a smile with the knuckle of his finger and sat back and continued. "Without the rabbits and dogs, without women, those heroes of yesteryear could only have existed in an uncivilised state. The slopes here are slippery. One can easily get desperate. That's why they brought the rabbit here. And they brought the cats here because no civilised creature can live with rats," I said. Landy continued his thoughtful pose. "Sure. It's about the native species now. This is our job, to eradicate these invasive species. What might Flanagan say today? Nothing should warrant any invasive creature living on a spot such as this." I was about to add something about the civilised not belonging in a wild place, when one of the Kiwis, Smith, added, "There wasn't any civilised creature living here before 1822, but following that there were hundreds of voyages. Like the Hawk, she wrecked and her crew survived 2 years in a cave here. Accounts suggest that the captain's wife survived in a secret cavern. Sound civilised?" The winds on those first few nights had circumnavigated the South Polar region without interruption, and they blasted through our camp, the buildings of which seemed to retort and cower, with a wrathful ferocity that excited, scared, and made us restlessly tired. I could not sleep. I felt hypnotised by those furious 50s. My poetic imagination sauntered in the semi-consciousness, outside at the whims of the wind, tumbling over the heights of the island, touching, smelling, listening for some wild mystery beyond. But the only mysteries I could sense were in rotten, grown-over remnants of exploration, repeater towers, shipwrecks, and the rising smoke of a fire in the bitter air of a half-dream. Extreme weather and sleepless nights reaped our little outpost for 5 days, by which time we had tweaked every part of our plan. As the weather cleared, we set out full of optimism and energy. Piloting a modified MD-500, John Maunder expertly carried out the aerial baiting phase, with Stevens advising and O'Neill capturing the magnificence of the island and our all-important work. I got to the work of acclimatising George, my terrier cross, and the Springer Spaniels, since they'd barely stretched their legs in the 8 days we'd been there. These dogs had been through 6 months of competition, proving to be the fittest. Maunder said that working with them made him feel even more proud of being on the team. 2 weeks later, he and 4 other expeditioners, including the journalist O'Neill, left the island on the Imagine Publica, leaving 8 of us to carry out the remainder 6 weeks of work. I was not aware that we would be without the likes of Maunder so early. Thus the task ahead of us appeared even more immense. 1 month into our mission, a number of things had become clear. Firstly, that the allocated time and resources, including manpower, would by all calculations fail the target of eradication. Secondly, that the social fabric and mental health of our reduced and isolated team was fracturing. This was clear to me, but I found it taboo to raise my concerns with anyone other than Anna Navalny. In the privacy of a secluded beach, amidst the sneezes and squabbles of thousands of penguins, Navalny, squinting, observed that the expedition had regressed since the departure of O'Neill, and that Landy was managing the island less like a scientist and more like a farmer. Indeed, he was placing unusual and unnecessary restrictions on our movements and inquiries. This further inhibited our ability to successfully carry out our work. On day 37, passing through the coastal featherbed track, George came upon skuas feeding on the carcass of a wandering albatross. In the 3 weeks since baiting, this was the 17th albatross marked as collateral. Again, I felt ambivalent about the work. The cold wind bit at my face, and I dreamed of what warm pleasantries family and friends might have been enjoying back home. Then George's bark rang out with a curious echo. He stood with a rabbit in his clutches at the ominous mouth of Hawk Cave. I was fascinated by this cave. It emerged in the middle of a little hill, surrounded by a wave of oceanic crust and tussock grass. Inside, it sloped down for 10 to 15 metres. It was cold and damp, and the ceiling was blackened by smoke. On the walls were nails and hooks. At the back of the cave, I examined a heap of various items: bones strewn about, rusted tin cans, some plastics, metals, a broken VHF transmitter, and the terrible odour of soiled clothing. George had climbed up on part of the wall and was barking near a small cavity. I climbed up and peered in, seeing nothing but the darkness of my imagination as it was seized by the smells of humanity and decomposing flesh. George jumped out of the dark hole with a rabbit in his mouth. I fell back, struck my head against the cavern floor and lost consciousness. Some moments later I woke to Navalny on a VHF transmission and waited, lying on my back, for her aid. Back at the station, I was treated by Dr. Landy and recounted my distressing findings to him in private. I suggested that we must make further inquiries into the secret cavern in the cave immediately, as my evidence pointed to unidentified human activity. He said that the cave was full of old rubbish and my ideas were absurd, baseless and distasteful. He claimed that I was suffering from hypothermia-induced hallucinations. I was ardent that I was not. I showed him my notebooks. He became defensive and we came to heads in a heated argument. I was told to rest for 3 days and I resisted, making comments about the inadequacy of the expedition and his leadership. Indeed, the expedition was falling apart. In 3 weeks of retrieval, we'd counted just under 6,000 successively poisoned specimens. In the following 3 days, Navalny counted another 40 albatross as collateral, as well as scores of petrels, kelp gulls and penguins. I waited out my sentence at the base and on day 41 set out with Navalny on the East Coast track to tally more rabbits and examine the feral cat population. I underscored my paranoia to Navalny, who, while listening, was sceptical of my claims about the cave. "So if there is something or someone there, where did they come from?" she said. I didn't want to hypothesize, but under my breath I could not stop. I had read about the crew of the Hawk and other ships, and observing the general behaviours and attitudes of Landy, wondered what administrative or actual misconduct might have been concealed here. As we walked across the most severe beauty of the island, through feldmark, fen and bog, bewildered by ophiolite maze, lush green otherworldliness, and the ever-changing moods of weather, I could not escape the cave in this tussle with fact and imagination. With admirable work ethic, attention and energy, Navalny continued collecting data while George pulled me along, burrow after burrow. It all seemed so futile. We would never eradicate these rabbits. And after all, maybe we were the invasive species. What foresight were we lacking in our attempts to correct our past mistakes? Did the scientific knowledge, the technical developments, the research, the numbers, did all this interference on the balance of things ever achieve any good? In my pessimism, I saw the whole human story on this island as an experiment, one which might end in a slow, cold death of this great and untamed convergence. I had joined this expedition believing we might learn to fix our mistakes and get the hell out of there, but increasingly I felt we were making things worse. I thought Flanagan might have been right, even today. The longer I stayed on that island, the more uncivilized I felt. Then it really hit me. A violent anger. Smith and McArdle called in on the VHF, alarming the team to a fire at Hawke Point. Moments later, Landy called in and affirmed that a periodic burning was overseen by he and Mulder at the advice of Stevens. Navalny now had a hunch. My rage was soon diffused by exhaustion. The day began to fade and we caught sight of the two-bunk hut, Shangri-La in Green Gorge, lit up by a blinding silver glow that bounced from the western seas. The following morning, we set out before sunrise, trekking northwest towards Hawke Point. With haste we moved through the spine of the land, shortcutting over difficult terrain on Mount Power and arriving at Island Lake. By the lake was a dilapidated hut, which we entered for a moment's rest and shelter. To our utter astonishment, there in the hut, shivering and rooted in dread, was a girl, perhaps 5 years old, who would not speak nor look at us. Her face was weathered and dirty and wet with tears. She wore multiple layers of clothing, the outer of which was an NPW snow jacket. Immediately, Navalny attended to the child and I called in an emergency on the VHF. Smith and McArdle were far south. Mulder left base and met us just south of Half Moon Bay. Navalny had strapped the child to my back, and we looked out northwest and could see the smouldering remains of the Hawke Cave fire distorting in the wind. We heard no word or sight of Landy in the 2 hours it took us to arrive at the station. As we came over the banks into the Tussle Bay, Stevens came running towards us like a madman. "Where's Landy?" I screamed. "He's dead," he said, pointing down to the beach. On the beach, a McCormack skua dive-bombed from height, scaring off its smaller cousins and landing on the still warm body of Dr. Landy, his head completely disfigured and blood strewn across the stony beach. A wild and garish fortissimo sounded around the bay. Birds playing in the howling wind, barking elephant seals, gacking emperors, and the southern ocean roaring, beating against the coast. The MV Nella Dan appeared on the horizon, its passionate red hull filling our grisly and depleted hearts with hope. We'd felt as if floating on a life raft for those 10 days. The majority of our expedition work was ceased in favour of the security and safety of all involved. The young girl's health improved dramatically, but we still held grave concern for her life. Navalny remained by her side in isolation from the rest of us. Smith and McArdle took watch over Hemsworth, who lingered in a delirium. Stevens, Mulder and I debriefed, documenting events and preparing the team to vacate the station. Thus we departed that island of wild originality, leaving behind its moments but not forgetting its lessons. Its cliffs faded away into the ocean cloud, its rabbits and cats still running amok. Remaining with us were the traumas and frustrations of our expedition, but the beauty of Maakuworri Island had already begun to escape me. The Nella Dan carried us through the grey southern ocean, over massive waves, its bows rising and diving down in slow, anxious seconds I felt might never end, until up again she would come. We passed through the furious 50s into warmer, bluer skies, and I pondered the island that lay ahead, so different with its civilization, its justice and its chaotic order. Looking south over the ocean, I felt a melancholy for that uncivilized moment we had left behind us. I felt nostalgia for that wild island of Maakuworri.